Jack Thompson gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He'd been driving for 30 years, but never had his nerves been so frayed. It wasn't the busy New York traffic that bothered him. No, it was the man in the back seat. "Can't you go any faster, you idiot?" Richard Hartley barked, his face red with anger. "I'm going to be late for my meeting." Jack glanced at the speedometer. He was already pushing the limit. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartley, but there's a lot of traffic. I'm doing my best to—" "Your best?" Richard scoffed. "If this is your best, I should have hired a monkey to drive me around. At least it would have been cheaper." Jack bit his tongue, forcing himself to focus on the road. He'd been Richard's driver for 5 years now, and not a day went by without some kind of insult. But he needed this job. With 2 kids in college and a mortgage to pay, he couldn't afford to lose it. As they inched forward in the gridlock, Jack's mind wandered to how he'd ended up here. He'd once dreamed of owning his own fleet of taxis, but life had other plans. Now at 50, he was stuck as a personal driver for a man who treated him like dirt. "Thompson, are you even listening to me?" Richard's voice cut through his thoughts. "Yes, Mr. Hartley. What can I do for you?" I said, "Take the next right. I know a shortcut." Jack hesitated. "Sir, that's a one-way street. We can't—" "Did I ask for your opinion? Just do as I say." Reluctantly, Jack turned right, praying they wouldn't run into any oncoming traffic. As they sped down the narrow street, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, a delivery truck appeared around the corner. Jack's instincts kicked in. He swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision. The car screeched to a halt, mere inches from a fire hydrant. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Richard exploded. "You incompetent fool! You could have killed us both!" Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartley, but if we hadn't turned down this street—" "Are you blaming me?" Richard's voice was dangerously low. "Maybe I should just fire you right now and be done with it." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jack knew he should apologize, grovel even, to keep his job. But something inside him snapped. "You know what, Mr. Hartley? Go ahead, fire me. I've put up with your insults and your abuse for 5 years. I've driven you safely through blizzards and heat waves. I've been on call 24/7, missing my kids, birthdays, and my wedding anniversary. And not once have you shown me an ounce of respect." Richard stared at him, mouth agape. For once, he seemed at a loss for words. Jack wasn't finished. "You think because you have money, you can treat people like they're nothing. But let me tell you something, Mr. Hartley. Your money doesn't make you a better person. It just makes you a richer asshole." As soon as the words left his mouth, Jack regretted them. He'd just thrown away his job, his livelihood. But to his surprise, Richard didn't yell. He didn't fire him on the spot. Instead, he laughed. It started as a chuckle, then grew into a full-bellied laugh. Jack watched in the rearview mirror, bewildered. "You've got guts, Thompson," Richard said, wiping tears from his eyes. "In all these years, no one's ever spoken to me like that, not even my wife." Jack didn't know how to respond. Was this a trick? "Tell you what," Richard continued, "get me to my meeting on time, and not only will I not fire you, I'll give you a raise." Still stunned, Jack nodded and pulled back onto the main road. As they drove, he could feel Richard's eyes on him. "You know, Thompson, maybe I've been too hard on you," Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "It's just, things haven't been easy lately. The market's been tough, and I've got people breathing down my neck." Jack nodded, unsure of what to say. He'd never seen this side of Richard before. As they pulled up to the office building, Richard hesitated before getting out. "Listen, Thompson, I'm sorry for everything. Let's start fresh, okay?" Jack was stunned. In 5 years, he'd never heard Richard apologize to anyone. He nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Okay, Mr. Hartley, fresh start." As Richard walked away, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would turn both their lives upside down. He was about to drive off when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily, Richard's wife. "Jack, can you pick me up? It's urgent. And please don't tell Richard." Jack frowned, confused by the secrecy. He typed back a quick reply. "Of course, Mrs. Hartley. Where should I meet you? The response came almost immediately. The Rosewood Hotel. Come to room 305. And Jack, be careful. As Jack pulled away from the curb, his mind raced with questions. What could be so urgent? And why the warning to be careful? He arrived at the Rosewood Hotel, a swanky establishment where Richard often held business meetings. Jack made his way to the third floor, his unease growing with each step. He knocked on the door of room 305. Mrs. Hartley, it's Jack. Is everything okay? The door opened a crack, and Emily's face appeared. She looked pale and worried. Jack, thank goodness you're here. Come in, quickly. As Jack stepped into the room, he noticed Emily wasn't alone. A man he didn't recognize sat in an armchair, looking nervous. Emily closed the door and turned to Jack. Jack, I'm sorry to drag you into this, but I didn't know who else to trust. This is Tom, Richard's business partner. We've uncovered something terrible. Tom stood up, extending his hand to Jack. Mr. Thompson, I've heard a lot about you. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Jack shook his hand, confusion written all over his face. I don't understand. What's going on? Emily and Tom exchanged glances. Finally, Emily spoke. Jack, Richard's life is in danger, and I'm afraid you might be in danger too. Jack's mind reeled from Emily's words. Danger? What kind of danger? Emily wrung her hands, her eyes darting nervously to Tom. It's complicated, Jack, but we believe someone is trying to kill Richard. Tom stepped forward, his voice low. And unfortunately, as Richard's driver, you might be caught in the crossfire. Jack sank into a nearby chair, trying to process this information. Just hours ago, his biggest concern had been Richard's insults. Now, he was being told their lives were at risk. But why? Jack asked. Who would want to kill Mr. Hartley? Tom and Emily exchanged another uneasy glance. It was Tom who spoke next. Jack, what do you know about Richard's latest real estate project? Jack shrugged. Not much, just that it's a big deal. Some kind of luxury development downtown. It's more than that, Tom said, pacing the room. It's the biggest project Hartley Enterprises has ever undertaken. But there's a problem. The land we're building on. It's not as clean as we thought. Emily cut in, her voice trembling. They found toxic waste buried there. If this gets out, it could ruin Richard. The company would be finished. Jack's head was spinning. But what does this have to do with someone wanting to kill Mr. Hartley? Tom sighed heavily. Because Richard knows who's responsible for the cover-up, and that person will do anything to keep it quiet. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Jack remembered the near miss from earlier that day. The truck that had almost hit them on the one-way street. Had that been an accident or something more sinister? The incident this morning, Jack said slowly. The truck that almost hit us. Was that? Emily nodded grimly. We think so. It was a warning shot. But next time, they might not miss. Jack stood up, suddenly feeling claustrophobic in the hotel room. I need to tell Mr. Hartley. He needs to know he's in danger. No, Emily and Tom said in unison. Tom stepped closer, his voice urgent. Jack, you can't tell Richard, not yet. If he knows, he might confront the person responsible, and that could get him killed. Then what am I supposed to do? Jack asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Just wait for the next attempt on his life? Emily placed a gentle hand on Jack's arm. We need your help, Jack. You're with Richard more than anyone. You can protect him without him knowing he's in danger. Jack ran a hand through his graying hair. This is crazy. I'm just a driver, not a bodyguard. You're more than that, Jack, Emily said softly. Richard may not show it, but he trusts you, and right now, you're our best hope of keeping him safe. Tom nodded in agreement. We're working on gathering evidence to expose the person behind this, but until then, we need you to be our eyes and ears. Jack paced the room, his mind racing. He thought about his family, about the risks he'd be taking, but then he thought about Richard. Despite everything, he couldn't stand by and let someone kill him. All right, Jack said finally. I'll do it. But I need to know everything. Who's behind this? What exactly am I up against? Tom and Emily shared a look of relief. "We can't tell you everything right now," Tom said. "It's safer if you don't know all the details. But we can give you this." He handed Jack a small device, no larger than a button. "It's a panic button. If you think Richard's in immediate danger, press it. We'll have a team respond immediately." Jack turned the device over in his hand, the weight of his new responsibility settling on his shoulders. "And what do I tell Mr. Hartley? How do I explain why I'm suddenly watching his every move?" Emily smiled sadly. "You don't. As far as Richard knows, nothing has changed. You're still just his driver, Jack. But now, you're also his guardian angel." As Jack left the hotel room, his head was spinning with all he'd learned. He made his way back to the car, his eyes scanning every shadow, every stranger on the street. The world suddenly seemed a lot more dangerous. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard. "Where the hell are you, Thompson? I need a ride back to the office. Now." Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. As he typed a reply, he realized his life had irrevocably changed. He was no longer just Jack Thompson, the driver. He was now Jack Thompson, the reluctant protector. He started the car, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. As he pulled away from the curb, a black SUV fell into line behind him. Jack's heart rate spiked. Was he being paranoid, or was he being followed? He took a series of random turns, his palms sweating on the steering wheel. The SUV stayed with him, turn for turn. Jack's finger hovered over the panic button in his pocket. Should he press it? Just as he was about to, the SUV turned off, disappearing down a side street. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. False alarm. But how many more of these would he have to endure? As he pulled up to Richard's office building, he saw his boss storming down the steps, his face a mask of irritation. Jack braced himself for the tirade to come. Richard yanked open the car door. "Thompson, where have you been? I've been waiting for—" He trailed off, noticing Jack's tense posture and wide eyes. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jack forced a smile. "Sorry, Mr. Hartley, just a bit of traffic." "Where to next?" Richard studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Home, and try not to get lost this time." As they pulled away, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Richard's eye. "Everything okay, Thompson?" Richard asked, a note of concern in his voice. "You seem off." Jack hesitated. Should he say something, warn him somehow? But Emily's words echoed in his mind. "You're still just his driver, Jack." "Everything's fine, Mr. Hartley," Jack replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about some family stuff." Richard nodded, seemingly satisfied. But as they drove through the bustling city streets, Jack couldn't help but wonder, how long could he keep up this charade? And more importantly, how long before the next attempt on Richard's life? As they approached a red light, a motorcycle pulled up alongside them. The rider's face was obscured by a dark helmet. Jack's hand inched towards the panic button in his pocket. The motorcyclist turned to look directly at them, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jack was sure this was it. But then the light turned green, and the motorcycle sped away. Jack let out a shaky breath. This job was going to give him a heart attack if the bad guys didn't get to him first. "Thompson," Richard's voice cut through his thoughts. "Take a left here. I want to stop by the site of the new development." Jack's blood ran cold. The toxic waste site. The very place at the heart of all this danger. He opened his mouth to object, but caught himself. How could he refuse without raising suspicion? "Of course, Mr. Hartley," he said, turning left. As they drove towards the development site, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading straight into the lion's den. As they approached the construction site, Jack's anxiety reached a fever pitch. The area was a hive of activity, with workers in hard hats scurrying around like ants. Heavy machinery dotted the landscape, digging into the earth that Jack now knew harbored a toxic secret. Richard leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with pride. "Look at it, Thompson. This is going to be my legacy. The Hartley Tower, the tallest building in the city." Jack nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's impressive, sir. But are you sure you want to get out here? It looks pretty busy." Richard waved off his concern. Nonsense, I want to see the progress up close. Pull over there. Reluctantly, Jack parked the car. As Richard got out, Jack's hand hovered over the panic button in his pocket. Should he call for help? But what would he say? That his boss wanted to inspect his own construction site? He got out of the car, eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. Workers paused to stare at Richard, some nodding respectfully, others whispering to each other. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that any one of them could be a threat. Richard strode confidently towards the site office, a prefab building at the edge of the lot. Jack hurried to keep up, his senses on high alert. As they approached the office, a man in a suit emerged, his face lighting up at the sight of Richard. "Mr. Hartley, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you today." Richard shook the man's hand. "Just thought I'd drop by for an impromptu inspection, Davis. How are things progressing? As Davis launched into a detailed report, Jack hung back, his eyes constantly sweeping the area. A movement caught his attention. A worker on a nearby scaffold was staring intently at Richard, his hand reaching into his jacket. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. Without thinking, he rushed forward, positioning himself between Richard and the scaffold. "Mr. Hartley," he interrupted, "I think we should head back. You have that important call in 20 minutes, remember?" Richard frowned. "What call? I don't remember scheduling any." His words were cut off by a loud crash. Jack spun around to see the scaffold collapsing, the worker who had been watching them tumbling to the ground along with a shower of tools and debris. In the chaos that followed, Jack grabbed Richard's arm, practically dragging him back to the car. "We need to leave, sir, now." For once, Richard didn't argue. As Jack peeled away from the site, he could see emergency vehicles already arriving in his rearview mirror. "What the hell just happened?" Richard demanded, his face pale. Jack's mind raced for an explanation. "Looks like an accident, sir. Lucky we weren't any closer." Richard nodded slowly, still looking shaken. "Yes, lucky. Good thinking on your part, Thompson. I didn't even remember that call." Jack felt a pang of guilt at the lie, but pushed it aside. He'd potentially just saved Richard's life. The real question was, had the scaffold collapse been an accident or another attempt on Richard's life? As they drove back towards the city, Jack's phone buzzed with a text. He checked it at a red light. It was from Emily. "Need to talk. Meet me at the usual place after you drop off Richard." Jack's stomach churned. What now? He dropped Richard off at his penthouse, making sure he got inside safely before heading to the usual place, a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop, where Emily often asked to be picked up when she wanted to avoid Richard. As he entered the shop, he spotted Emily in a corner booth, her face hidden behind large sunglasses despite the dim lighting. He slid into the seat across from her. "Mrs. Hartley," he started, but she cut him off. "Jack, I told you, call me Emily when Richard's not around." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "What happened at the construction site? Tom's contact said there was some kind of accident." Jack recounted the events, watching Emily's face grow paler with each word. When he finished, she sat back, removing her sunglasses to reveal red-rimmed eyes. "This is worse than we thought," she murmured. "They're getting bolder. Jack, I don't know if we can protect him." Jack felt a surge of determination. "We have to try. Mr. Hartley may not be the easiest person to work for, but he doesn't deserve to die." Emily reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "You're a good man, Jack. Richard's lucky to have you, even if he doesn't realize it." There was a moment of charged silence, and Jack suddenly became acutely aware of Emily's hand on his. He gently pulled away, clearing his throat. "So what's our next move?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Tom thinks he's close to identifying who's behind all this. Once we have proof, we can go to the authorities, but until then, I keep playing bodyguard without Mr. Hartley knowing," Jack finished. Emily nodded. "I hate asking this of you, Jack. If anything happened to you..." She trailed off, her eyes glistening. Jack felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. "I'll be careful," he promised. "But Emily, there's something I need to know. How much does Richard know about the toxic waste?" Emily's face hardened. "He knows everything. He's the one who ordered the cover-up." Jack felt like he'd been punched in the gut. But why? Surely he knows how dangerous that is. Money, Emily said bitterly. It always comes down to money with Richard. The cost of proper disposal would have bankrupted the company. So he decided to bury it, literally and figuratively. Jack sat back, his mind reeling. The man he'd been driving around, the man he was now risking his life to protect, had willingly put countless lives at risk for profit. I know what you're thinking, Emily said softly. But Jack, despite everything, Richard isn't a bad man. He's just lost his way. I have to believe he can find his way back. Jack nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him. Could a man like Richard really change? As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard. Thompson, where are you? I need you to drive me to a meeting in 30 minutes. Jack showed the text to Emily. She nodded, her face a mask of worry. Be careful, Jack, and remember, no matter what happens, you can't let Richard know what's going on. As Jack stood to leave, Emily caught his arm. Jack, thank you for everything. He managed a small smile. Just doing my job, Mrs. Hartley. As he walked back to his car, Jack felt the weight of his responsibility more keenly than ever. He was protecting a man who had knowingly endangered others, keeping secrets from his employer, and getting tangled in a web of deceit that seemed to grow more complex by the hour. He slid behind the wheel, taking a deep breath to steady himself. As he pulled away from the curb, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving not just towards Richard's meeting, but towards a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of a black SUV pulling out behind him. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Was it the same one from before? Was he being paranoid? Or was the net closing in around them? As he navigated the busy streets, Jack's mind raced. How long could he keep up this charade? How long before Richard figured out what was going on? And most pressingly, how long before the next attempt on Richard's life? Little did Jack know, the answers to these questions were coming sooner than he could have ever imagined. Jack pulled up to Richard's penthouse, his nerves on edge. As Richard climbed into the back seat, Jack noticed something different about him. The usually brash and loud businessman seemed subdued, almost pensive. Everything all right, Mr. Hartley? Jack asked, meeting Richard's eyes in the rearview mirror. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Just drive, Thompson, and make it quick. As they merged into traffic, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Richard was never this quiet. He kept glancing in the mirror, watching his boss stare out the window, lost in thought. Suddenly, Richard spoke. Thompson, what do you think about legacy? The question caught Jack off guard. Legacy, sir. Yes, legacy. What we leave behind when we're gone. The mark we make on the world. Richard's voice was uncharacteristically soft. Jack chose his words carefully. I suppose it depends on the person, sir. Some people want to leave behind great achievements. Others just want to be remembered as good people. Richard nodded slowly. And what about you, Thompson? What kind of legacy do you want to leave? Jack swallowed hard, thinking about his family, about the secret he was keeping to protect this man. I just want my kids to be proud of me, sir, to know I always tried to do the right thing. A heavy silence fell over the car. Jack could almost hear the gears turning in Richard's head. The right thing, Richard murmured. Sometimes it's not so easy to know what that is. Before Jack could respond, Richard's phone rang. He answered it, his voice instantly shifting back to its usual brusque tone. Hartley here. What? No, absolutely not. I don't care what it costs. Make it happen. As Richard continued his heated conversation, Jack's mind raced. What had prompted this sudden philosophical turn? Could Richard be having second thoughts about the toxic waste cover-up? They arrived at their destination, a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city. As Richard got out, he paused. Thompson, wait here. This shouldn't take long. Jack nodded, watching Richard disappear into the building. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, debating whether to call Emily or Tom. Should he tell them about Richard's odd behavior? Before he could decide, movement caught his eye. A man in a dark suit was hurrying towards the building, his hand inside his jacket. Jack's instincts screamed danger. Without thinking, he leapt out of the car and ran towards the building. He burst through the doors just in time to see the man in the suit pull out a gun, aiming it at Richard's back. "Mr. Hartley, get down!" Jack yelled, launching himself at the gunman. They crashed to the floor, the gun skittering across the polished tiles. Jack grappled with the man, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear shouts and screams around them, but his focus was solely on subduing the attacker. Suddenly, a sharp pain exploded in his side. The man had pulled a knife, slashing at Jack wildly. Despite the pain, Jack managed to pin the man's arm, twisting until he dropped the knife. Security guards finally arrived, pulling the attacker away. Jack slumped against the wall, his hand pressed to his bleeding side. Richard rushed over, his face pale with shock. "Thompson, my God, are you all right?" Jack nodded weakly. "I'm okay, Mr. Hartley. Are you hurt?" Richard shook his head, kneeling beside Jack. You saved my life. Why? After how I've treated you." Jack managed a small smile. "Just doing my job, sir." As paramedics rushed in and the police began to secure the scene, Jack's vision started to blur. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Richard's face, etched with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. When Jack awoke, he was in a hospital bed. The steady beep of monitors filled the room. He blinked, trying to focus, and was surprised to see Richard sitting in a chair by his bed. "Mr. Hartley?" Jack's voice was hoarse. Richard leaned forward, relief evident on his face. "Thompson, thank God you're awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Jack groaned. "What happened?" "The gunman is in custody," Richard finished. "The police are questioning him now." "Thompson, Jack, I don't know how to thank you. You risked your life for me." Jack shifted uncomfortably, wincing at the pain in his side. "Anyone would have done the same, sir." Richard shook his head. "No, they wouldn't have, especially not after how I've treated you." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Jack, about the kind of person I've become, the choices I've made. I think it's time I made some changes." Jack's heart raced. Could Richard be talking about the toxic waste? Before he could respond, the door opened and Emily rushed in, followed closely by Tom. "Jack!" Emily cried, hurrying to his bedside. "Oh, thank God you're all right." Tom hung back, his face grim. "Richard, we need to talk, now." Richard stood, looking between Jack and Emily with a quizzical expression. "What's going on? How did you two know Jack was here?" Emily froze, realizing their mistake. Jack's mind raced for an explanation, but he was still groggy from the pain medication. Tom stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. "Richard, there's something you need to know. We've been trying to protect you. Jack's been helping us." Richard's face darkened. "Protect me? From what?" "From the people who want you dead because of what you buried at the construction site," Emily said softly. The color drained from Richard's face. He sank back into his chair, looking from Emily to Tom to Jack. You all knew about the toxic waste?" Jack nodded weakly. "We've been trying to keep you safe, Mr. Hartley, to give us time to gather evidence and find out who's behind the attacks." Richard buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red. "I've made such a mess of everything. I thought I was protecting the company, my legacy. But at what cost?" Emily moved to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late to make it right, Richard." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right. It's time I faced the consequences of my actions." He turned to Jack. "I owe you more than I can ever repay, Thompson. Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what real integrity looks like." As Jack looked at the faces surrounding his hospital bed, Richard's remorseful, Emily's hopeful, Tom's determined, he realized that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. The sound of his heart monitor quickened as a thought struck him. "Mr. Hartley," he said urgently, "if the gunman's in custody, that means someone else might try again. We need to—" His words were cut off by a commotion in the hallway. Shouts and the sound of running feet echoed through the door. Richard stood, moving protectively in front of Jack's bed. "What the hell is going on out there?" Tom cracked open the door, peering out. His face paled. We've got company, and they don't look friendly. As the sounds of chaos grew louder, Jack realized that their ordeal was far from over. In fact, it seemed the real fight was just beginning. The door burst open, and two men in suits rushed in, their hands reaching inside their jackets. Tom reacted instantly, tackling one of them to the ground. Richard, in a move that surprised everyone, charged at the other, using his bulk to slam the intruder against the wall. Emily screamed, backing away towards Jack's bed. Jack, fighting through the pain, tried to sit up, his instincts screaming at him to protect the others. "Stay down!" a voice boomed from the doorway. A woman strode in, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She held a badge in one hand and a gun in the other. "FBI, everyone freeze." The room fell silent, save for the rapid beeping of Jack's heart monitor. The two men Richard and Tom had tackled slowly raised their hands. "Agent Sarah Reeves," the woman announced, holstering her weapon. "Mr. Hartley, we need to talk." Richard straightened up, his face a mix of confusion and relief. "FBI, what's going on?" Agent Reeves nodded to her colleagues, who quickly cuffed the two intruders. "We've been investigating a ring of corrupt real estate developers involved in illegal waste disposal. Your name came up, Mr. Hartley." Richard's shoulders sagged. I can explain. I'm sure you can," Reeves said, her tone neutral. "But right now, we need to get you all to a safe location. There's more going on here than you realize." As nurses and more FBI agents flooded the room, Jack found himself being carefully transferred to a wheelchair. His head spun, trying to process everything that was happening. "Wait," he called out, grabbing Richard's arm as they were ushered out of the room. "Mr. Hartley, are you okay?" Richard looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. "Thanks to you, Jack. I don't deserve your concern, but thank you." They were quickly moved to a secure wing of the hospital, with armed guards posted at every entrance. Agent Reeves gathered them in a large conference room, her face grave. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," she began. "Mr. Hartley, your toxic waste dump is just the tip of the iceberg. We've uncovered a massive conspiracy involving several major real estate developers, waste management companies, and corrupt city officials." Richard sank into a chair, his face ashen. "I had no idea. I thought it was just our company cutting corners." Reeves shook her head. "It goes much deeper. The people behind this are dangerous. They've already killed to keep their secret, and they won't hesitate to do it again." Jack leaned forward in his wheelchair, wincing at the pain in his side. The attempts on Mr. Hartley's life. It wasn't just about silencing him, was it? "No," Reeves confirmed. "They wanted to make an example of him. Show what happens to anyone who might consider coming clean." Emily, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "But why involve the FBI? Isn't this a local matter?" Reeves' expression darkened. "We've traced links to international crime syndicates. They've been using these development projects to launder money on a massive scale. This goes way beyond toxic waste." The room fell silent as the enormity of the situation sank in. Jack's mind reeled. He'd signed up to be a driver, not to be caught in the middle of an international crime conspiracy. Richard stood up suddenly, his face set with determination. "I'll testify, whatever you need. I'll give you names, dates, everything I know." Reeves nodded approvingly. "That's a start, Mr. Hartley, but it won't be easy. These people have long reach and deep pockets. We'll need to place you in witness protection." "What about the rest of us?" Tom asked, gesturing to himself, Emily, and Jack. "How much danger are we in?" "Considerable," Reeves admitted. "You've all seen and heard too much. We'll need to protect you as well." Jack's heart sank. Witness protection meant leaving everything behind. His home, his job, even contact with his family. He thought of his children, of the life he'd built. As if reading his thoughts, Richard turned to him. "Jack, I'm so sorry. I've dragged you into this mess. If there's anything I can do—" Jack cut him off. "Mr. Hartley, with all due respect, you can start by doing the right thing. Tell them everything you know. Help bring these people to justice." Richard nodded solemnly. "I will, I promise." Over the next few hours, they were briefed on the witness protection program. New identities, new locations, a complete severing of ties with their past lives. It was overwhelming, to say the least. As night fell, they were moved to a safe house on the outskirts of the city. Jack found himself sharing a room with Richard, a strange twist of fate that wasn't lost on either of them. "I never thought I'd say this," Richard said as they settled in. "But I'm glad you're here, Thompson. I don't think I could face this alone." Jack managed a small smile. "You're not alone, Mr. Hartley. We're all in this together now." As they tried to sleep, Jack's mind wandered to the future. What would his new life look like? Would he ever see his children again? And how long would they have to live in hiding before it was safe to reclaim their lives? A noise outside their window made both men sit up. They exchanged worried glances. Had they been found already? Richard moved to the window, peering out cautiously. "It's okay," he said after a moment. "Just an agent doing his rounds." As Richard returned to his bed, Jack noticed something different about his former boss. The arrogant, demanding man he'd known for years seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone more humble, more human. "Jack," Richard said softly, "I know it doesn't change anything, but I want you to know, I'm truly sorry for everything. The way I treated you, the corners I cut, the lives I put at risk. I was so focused on building my empire that I lost sight of what really matters." Jack was silent for a moment, processing Richard's words. "It's not too late to make amends, Mr. Hartley. What you do from here on out, that's what will define your legacy." Richard nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. "You're right, and I swear I'm going to make this right, whatever it takes." As they drifted off to sleep, Jack couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Despite the danger, despite the uncertain future, they had a chance to do something truly important, to right a wrong that affected countless lives. But little did they know, their resolve would soon be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. For even as they slept, forces were moving against them, setting in motion a chain of events that would push them to their limits and force them to question everything they thought they knew. In the shadows outside the safe house, a figure watched silently, a phone pressed to their ear. "They're here," the figure whispered. "All of them. What are your orders?" The response came swiftly, and the figure nodded, a cruel smile spreading across their face. The real game was about to begin. As dawn broke, Jack was jolted awake by a commotion outside. He sat up, wincing at the pain in his side, to see Richard already at the window. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. Richard turned, his face pale. "We're moving. Now. Agent Reeves says our location's been compromised." Jack's heart raced as he struggled to his feet. The safe house erupted into controlled chaos as FBI agents rushed to gather their belongings and secure their charges. Agent Reeves burst into their room, her face grim. "We have a mole in the department. We need to get you all out of here immediately." As they were hurried to a waiting convoy of unmarked vehicles, Jack caught glimpses of Emily and Tom, both looking as shaken as he felt. The gravity of their situation hit him anew. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. They were all targets now. They sped through the early morning streets, the city still half asleep. Jack found himself in a car with Richard and Agent Reeves, the tension palpable. "Where are we going?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reeves shook her head. "The less you know, the better. We're implementing Protocol Omega. Complete communication blackout, new identities, new locations. You won't know where the others are being taken." Jack's stomach dropped. "What about my family, my kids? They'll be protected," Reeves assured him. "But for their safety and yours, you can't have any contact with them. I'm sorry." The car fell silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. Jack stared out the window, watching the familiar cityscape fade away, possibly for the last time. Suddenly, a black SUV swerved into their lane, cutting them off. Reeves cursed, grabbing for her weapon. "It's them. Hold on." Their driver executed a perfect evasive maneuver, but two more SUVs appeared, boxing them in. Jack's training kicked in. "Mr. Hartley, get down." Gunfire erupted, shattering their windows. Jack threw himself over Richard, shielding him with his body. He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder but ignored it, focusing on keeping Richard safe. Their car spun out of control, crashing into a storefront. Through the haze of pain and shock, Jack saw Agent Reeves slumped over, blood trickling from her forehead. "We have to move," Jack grunted, pulling Richard from the wreckage. "Can you run?" Richard nodded, his eyes wide with fear. They stumbled away from the car, ducking into a narrow alley as their pursuers closed in. "Jack, you're hurt," Richard gasped, noticing the blood soaking through Jack's shirt. "I'm fine," Jack lied, gritting his teeth against the pain. "We need to keep moving." They weaved through back alleys and side streets, the sounds of pursuit never far behind. Jack's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. As they rounded a corner, they nearly collided with Emily and Tom, who had apparently escaped their own ambush. "Oh, thank God," Emily sobbed, embracing Richard. I thought they'd got you." Tom, ever practical, was already scanning for escape routes. "We can't stay here. They'll have this whole area locked down soon." Jack nodded, fighting to stay focused through the pain and blood loss. "We need to get somewhere safe. Regroup. Any ideas?" Richard's face suddenly lit up. "I know a place. An old warehouse my company owns. It's off the books. No one knows about it but me." They made their way to the warehouse, narrowly avoiding detection several times. By the time they arrived, Jack was pale and sweating, barely able to stand. "We need to treat that wound," Tom said, helping Jack to sit. As Emily tended to Jack's injury with a makeshift first aid kit they found, Richard paced the dusty floor. "This is all my fault," he muttered. "If I hadn't been so greedy, so blind." Jack winced as Emily cleaned his wound. "Mr. Hartley, now's not the time for self-pity. We need a plan." Tom nodded in agreement. "Jack's right. We can't run forever. We need to fight back." "But how?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "We're up against an entire criminal organization. We don't even know who we can trust in law enforcement." A heavy silence fell over the group. The enormity of their situation weighed on them all. Then Richard spoke up, his voice filled with a determination Jack had never heard before. "We use their playbook against them. We have something they want, information, and we're going to use it to bring them down." Over the next few hours, they formulated a plan. Richard would reach out to his contacts in the media, threatening to go public with everything he knew. Meanwhile, Tom would use his tech skills to hack into the company's servers, gathering all the evidence they could. "It's risky," Jack warned. "They'll come at us with everything they've got." Richard nodded grimly. "I know, but it's the only way. We have to end this once and for all." As night fell, they put their plan into motion. Richard made his call, his voice steady as he laid out his ultimatum. Tom worked feverishly on a laptop they'd managed to procure, sifting through years of corrupt dealings and illegal activities. Emily kept watch, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger, and Jack, despite his injury, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He knew their enemies wouldn't go down without a fight. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just as dawn was breaking, Tom let out a triumphant shout. "I've got it. Everything we need to bring them down. Financial records, emails, even recordings of meetings. It's all here." A wave of relief washed over the group. But Jack knew their ordeal wasn't over yet. "We need to get this to someone we can trust. Someone with the power to act on it." As if on cue, Richard's phone rang. He answered cautiously, then his face broke into a disbelieving smile. "It's the Attorney General. They're ready to move on our information." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Federal agents swarmed the warehouse, securing the evidence and taking their statements. News broke of a massive corruption scandal, implicating dozens of high-ranking officials and business leaders. In the days that followed, Jack watched from a hospital bed as the empire of corruption crumbled. Richard testified tirelessly, making good on his promise to set things right. Tom's technical expertise proved invaluable in unraveling the complex web of illegal activities. And Emily, to everyone's surprise, became a vocal advocate for corporate responsibility and environmental protection. As for Jack, he was hailed as a hero. His actions had not only saved Richard's life multiple times, but had been crucial in exposing the truth. As he recovered, he pondered the strange turn his life had taken. From a simple driver to a key player in one of the biggest scandals in the city's history. One afternoon, as he was preparing to be discharged, he received a visit from Richard. The man who entered his room bore little resemblance to the arrogant boss he'd known for years. This Richard was humbler, his eyes carrying the weight of his experiences but also a newfound purpose. "Jack," Richard began, taking a seat beside the bed, "I can never fully express my gratitude for what you've done. You saved more than just my life. You saved my soul." Jack shook his head. "You saved yourself, Mr. Hartley. You chose to do the right thing when it mattered most." Richard smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression that Jack had never seen before. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about legacy, about what really matters in life, and I've made a decision." He handed Jack an envelope. Inside was a document transferring a significant portion of Hartley Enterprises shares to Jack's name. "I can't accept this," Jack stammered, shocked by the gesture. "You can and you will," Richard insisted. "It's not just a thank you. It's an investment in the future. I want you on the board, Jack. We're going to rebuild this company the right way, with integrity and responsibility at its core." As Jack left the hospital that day, he felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Fear of the challenges ahead, certainly, but also hope. Hope for a better future, not just for himself and his family, but for all those affected by the corrupt practices they'd exposed. He thought about the long journey that had brought him to this point. The insults he'd endured, the dangers he'd faced, the moral quandaries he'd navigated. It hadn't been easy, but standing there in the sunlight, with a new purpose and a second chance at life, Jack Thompson knew one thing for certain: every mile had been worth it.